All right, some people are still ticking in, but I think we can start. A very warm welcome to our Americs webinar today from a very gray and a little bit rainy Berlin. Before we start, my name is Nils Grunberg. I'm a senior analyst here at Americs in Berlin, and I have an important message for everyone. That is, we are recording this entire session and including the Q&A. A link to the recording will be made available online on our Merrick's webpage in some days. If you like more information about our privacy protection policy, please feel free to check out the Merrick's webpage for further details. So today's webinar will focus on the upcoming 14th five-year plan. 3 weeks ago, roughly, the party leadership held its 5th plenum in Beijing, and it adopted a proposal for the general structure and the content of the five-year plan, which will now be finalized and published during the National People's Congress in March next year. This plan is really important, of course, for China's strategy for the next 5 years, how to develop, but it is also, it included a set of goals for China's development for the year 2035. And I think no one here in the audience doubts how important it really is to understand this strategic policy framework. And we're very happy today to have two very qualified and knowledgeable experts to help us exactly doing that. We have Alicia Garcia Herrero, a trained economist based in Hong Kong, where she works as the chief economist for Asia Pacific, the French Bank of Natixis. She is also a professor at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and a visiting lecturer at the China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai. She's also has a footing in the think tank world, is a senior fellow at Bruegel and a member of Real Instituto Elcano, and she has published extensively on several economic issues. We also have Bert Hoffman, the director of the East Asia Institute, professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School in the National University of Singapore. And before that, that stint in Singapore since 2009, he has worked at the World Bank for 27 years, including being the chief representative for the World Bank in China and the chief economist for East Asia. He has also worked at the Kiel Institute of World Economics and at the OECD and ING Bank. Bert has extensive experience in advising governments and economic development issues, and also has published widely on fiscal policy, decentralization, trade, and Asian economies. So with these two very knowledgeable experts, I think we should kick things off with a brief assessment by both Alicia and Bert on what we know so far about the plan. And we will then move into a discussion until around 13:45. And after that, we will have room for around half an hour of an open Q&A. And I will give you further information on that will proceed. But for now, please let us get started. Alicia, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure really to share views with such a knowledgeable think tank as Merrick's. I have the pleasure to hear conversations at the advisory board, and I'm always like, wow, we are so lucky in Europe to have such a good think tank on Chinese issues. So it's very hard to talk to you because you know it all, but I'm going to try my best. I think perhaps what I can do is really to put this into context. First of all, because I have a very, very clear memory of the third plenum in 2013. And I have a clear memory because, you know, I was about to have my fourth baby. It was a very important moment for me, but because I was expecting that third plenum to be illuminating in terms of reforms. And I still remember how much I struggled to figure what the role of the state would be as opposed to the market. That is 2013. This time around, and I think that's my key message, I don't see that dichotomy or these fighting forces between the market and the state. They aren't there. Why aren't they there? Because maybe China has already made up its mind. I don't mean to say it's all state-driven economy, but there's no such thing as, you know, like like in a non-decisive decisive approach. It is decided it's going to be, according to my reading of this plenum, and therefore the 5-year plan. And the plenum is much more than the 5-year plan. Let's realize that there are targets 2035, in a way 2049, and 2060. So I don't mean to say that the 5-year plan is not important, but the plenum is humongously important. And there we have a clear view that the state is there to illuminate us, to illuminate what China should be. And it's all about very, very important words such as, high tech, AI. I mean, all of these words that basically make it very clear that China doesn't want to depend on anybody on technology. So that's the self-reliance. Let's narrow down the concept of self-reliance. It's not about everything. It's about the real bottlenecks. It's about, of course, semiconductors. It's about, any kind of technological progress that could, be harmful for China. I think because China has already probably realized that in the good old times, maybe being dependent on energy could hurt you. But now, China has access directly through purchases or indirectly to so many sources of energy that's not a problem. Plus, there's an energy glut in the world, so that can't be the problem. The problem is probably no longer either, food or. So the problem, their bottleneck is tech, and in some kinds of, as I said, especially semiconductors. There are others, and that's what the plan is about. But the plan doesn't end there, because you don't get, you don't feed, if I can use that word, a population of 1.3 billion through tech. And what I mean to say here is that if you actually look at the increase in R&D, in research and development expense in China, most of which, by the way, is government. I go back to the idea that, that division between government and market, to me, is very clear by now. The government is still in charge for that technological development, and the market is fine for, other sectors that might not be as relevant. But having said that, I think the point here is that you can't feed, i.e., make a market of the size of China productive only out of tech. So you need to do something else to grow. And the growth target, although many people say it's not there, it is there implicitly. Because when you say, and the plenum says it very clearly, that China needs to become a moderately developed economy, and you relate to a number, and the number out there is $20,000 of today, meaning we have to think in real growth terms, how much growth you need in the next 15 years, because the target is by 2035. You need 4.72. That's high. That's high. For China to grow that in real terms for the next 15 years, you need to be very lucky, I have to tell you. I don't think, we've estimated our own growth rate long term is about, if we're lucky, 3.7, and it's coming down to 2.4 in the 5 last years, 2030 to 35. So basically, it's still challenging. You can't do that only with tech. Total factor productivity cannot be as big per capita as you would need for China to grow at that rate per capita. And thus, you need to do something else. And that's what the plan hardly mentions, but is clearly there, which is the all good things that China has always done. Urbanize, more infra, more real estate. It is there. So the target, although we don't have a target for urbanization, to me is going to move all the way to 70. Brazil has a urbanization rate of 70. By the way, it's not ideal because, it produces mega cities, hard to manage, etc. But I think China will have to go on that road, because that tech dream, what I call the tech dream of the fifth plenum, is not going to be enough to create the growth needed for disposable income to grow at that pace that China has promised everybody, meaning $20,000 by 2035. I think I'm right on time, I think 10 minutes. So I want to leave it here, and very happy to hear from you and more questions later.
Yes, thank you. Please, Bert, would you give us your opening?
All right, well, great to be here, and thanks for having me, and thanks for Alicia for kicking off and cutting into this very difficult question whether 4.7% growth is actually feasible. What I'd like to emphasize on in the current proposals for the long-term goals and the 5-year plan is first the keen awareness of the external environment. It's obvious. Also in Beijing, they've noticed that there is great tensions between the United States and China, and but more broadly, as China says, it is a very complex and external environment. There's also COVID. There's lots of countries that are inward-looking, that have become more nationalistic. There's more protectionism around the world, and that in a way helps shape the plan. The key plank in it is really what they call dual circulation as being the new development paradigm. But what it really means is more domestic development than compared to the past. It's not closing off China, but it is much more focused on domestic development, much more focused on domestic demand. That's one. Much more focused on expanding domestic supply chains. And third, expanding or relying more on indigenous innovation or on domestic technology. Clearly, and that links to the second element, which I find very striking in the document as it was released, the proposals, is this notion of risk and risk management and ensuring security. And it's security, secure access to technology, it's secure access to supply, it's secure access to food security, and security for the people. So if you want, the leadership in China sees quite an uncertain world ahead, and they see as a main role sort of ensuring a secure development for China to reach these long-term goals by 2035, to reach what is the basic socialist modernization by 2035, which, by the way, is interesting to note that it's a more ambitious plan than 3 years ago. The 19th Party Congress in 2017 really already talked about the new era and the first phase of the new era until 2035. And they were a bit less clear about the goals there. This basically achieving socialist modernization, and call it $20,000 per capita, but there's more to it, is actually accelerated compared to the 19th Party Congress. This dual circulation, much emphasis on innovation. There is another plan in the pipeline. It's the medium and long-term plan for science and technology. Because the second plank in that innovation is more emphasis on foundational technologies, as we would call it. Clearly, in light of the threat of being cut off from some of the technologies needed for development, notably integrated circuits, but there's lots of other more foundational technologies as well that are at risk. China wants to be in that space and wants to have much more fundamental technologies, breakthroughs, as the plan says. They're looking for breakthroughs in science and their own foundational technologies. The third element that I found really interesting is an expressed objective on China's involvement in global governance. On the one hand, it's environment, and I'll say a few words there later, but on one hand, it's taking the lead on ecological and environmental cooperation, as China says, actively participate in the reforms of global economic governance. So that means WTO and World Bank and IMF, and including a third element, which is interesting, we may discuss later, is to follow international practice on debt sustainability, which was one of the lines that struck me. Fourth, lots of domestic environmental goals, But one of the big absences was the international environmental goals. Xi Jinping at the United Nations gave a big speech where they placed the target of carbon neutrality by 2060. And a lot of people got very excited about it. Most of Europe is carbon neutral by 2050, but they are already far more carbon neutral than China is currently. So I had personally expected an adjustment of China's short to medium term goals, i.e. the next 5 years, to meet that long-term goal of carbon neutrality by 2060. That's not the case. And frankly, I think that without adjustments over the next 5 years, a sharper target of carbon emission over the next 5 years, China will not be able to make that carbon neutrality by 2060. Of course, 2060 is very far away, and in part, China thinks that it can rely on technological developments to meet that target of 2060, including carbon capture, including hydrogen, including other technologies that are mentioned in the proposals for the plan. But there's no target, no extra target beyond the Paris Agreement commitments of China, i.e. a peak carbon by 2030 and a decline afterwards. There's no extra target mentioned in the 5-year plan. Let me stop here and let's hear your questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both of you for very helpful and insightful comments here. And I think I would like to start with a question for you, Bert, directly following up. And maybe we should take a step backwards. And I'm sure that as a representative for the World Bank in Beijing, you must have had quite some insights into the policy making and the drafting, the different stages of a 5-year plan drafting. So could you explain to us, like, what type of document is the 5-year plan? How is it drafted? Who is participating in the drafting, and who decides on what comes into the plan? And I maybe also how unusual it is that there are some targets for a 15-year period in this plan. To my knowledge, that has only been the case once before. So is this a normal 5-year plan, or what is different this time?
Okay, good. Well, the plan is not the plan like the old days. If people still think that the plan is like the central plan of the past with lots of targets, how many tons of cement, how many tons of steels, there's none of that is going to be in the plan. Since sort of the mid-90s, the plan has evolved into what we would call a strategic plan, a strategic vision of the government, with still some targets, but a lot of them are indicative targets, including the growth target is an indicative target, and then a number of specific objectives of the government to meet that is largely in the government's control. So if you want quite a modern plan for any government around the world. The way it's done, the drafting, so the hard work is done by the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission. It used to be the State Planning Commission, and in the old days, but it's now called differently. And they really take about 2 years to draft that plan and take inputs from all walks of life, including from the World Bank and other international organizations. And I actually started giving some inputs into the plan. And in previous incarnations of the plan, we've also given input. The World Bank has given input. But many domestic organizations give input into a draft of the plan. But then what we're talking about today is really the proposals of the party. So there's a separate party process, separate from the government process, where much more the political issues are being discussed. And that this time around, normally that is led by the Prime Minister in charge of social and economic developments. And on the 13th 5-year plan, I had the pleasure of a briefing or giving some inputs to Li Keqiang, who was the premier. This time around, it's been very much led by Xi Jinping. And after the release of the proposals, he actually explained that he had led many Politburo meetings, so the highest level of the party, had a number of meetings on the proposals and he had led that discussion. He had also taken some inputs from experts, and there was a heavily publicized round with some economic and social experts on the plan. And so then after the Politburo discussion, the fifth plenum has the whole Central Party Committee. It's about 200 people, members, and about 160 alternate members that are discussing then the proposals as formulated by a drafting team. And it's nominally led by Xi Jinping, but probably the key vice premier on social economic developments, i.e. Liu He, probably was holding the pen together with his team. And so then we're now at the stage where the party has given guidance to the government, and then the NDRC takes over again, finalizes the plan, submits it to the National People's Congress early next year. It's being discussed and probably approved by March next year at the National People's Congress annual meeting.
All right, thank you. Alicia, you mentioned in your opening you cannot feed a country on technology alone. And at its outset, the plan is really on socio-economic development. It's a much broader plan, at least it usually is. So, beyond the tech dimension, which we will go into a bit later, poverty has been officially eradicated this year. And now it seems that inequality is the new growing issue and moving into a high income country by 2035. But do you think this is realistic at all? And what are the main socioeconomic facts that are weighing on China's long-term growth opportunities? What are the stones that China now needs to fumble for by crossing this new river, as you could say?
It's a very good question. First of all, because we know for a fact that tech is not equalizing in terms of income, and we've learned that the hard way. And I think China does know that, and that might even explain why we're seeing things we're seeing lately with financial, with all the whole idea of cracking down on excessive concentration in the tech industry. So that's one aspect. We can go back, talk about that later. But I think that the whole idea is that not only, as we know very well, although it's very hard to find Gini coefficients for China, I'm sure you know and know exactly how unequal income distribution really is. But we know that it's actually become more unequal for quite a few years. It's hard to tell whether the latest data is in that direction. We have a lot of discussion, but it doesn't matter because COVID-19 will make it more unequal. And this is not China, this is the world. So if we start on that basis, I think the pressure for this plan to really include measures that make better or more equal income distribution a priority. I mean, these forces must be as relevant as ever. It's not only, oh great, we're moving away from poverty to something more, like developed country type problem. No, it is just going to become such a huge issue, because when you look at the impact of COVID everywhere, if you look at non-urban unemployment, although of course we don't have official figures, but you can already tell that that's going to become a huge scar in the post-COVID world. You may manage it now somehow, but it's going to be very hard to manage it later. So this is essential. And again, this is why two things to me we will be seeing more clearly in the plan. One is what I mentioned, that we need rough growth, all type growth, because it creates employment. So think about infrastructure, I think all of that. We still need it. And I think that it's already acknowledged. Urbanization is a big chunk of that idea of the plenum. So it isn't a big chunk. It is a bit hidden, but it is there. and we know it will be important. And the other one, which I don't know how it's going to be tackled, but it is needed, is that the welfare state, I think. I mean, the idea that could China have managed better the collapse in not only disposable income, but of course retail sales with consequences for consumption, had China had automatic stabilizers like Europe. You know, we Europeans think our model is, you know, who wants to look at our model. But during COVID-19, that was a very important lesson, that thanks to these automatic stabilizers, you could kind of smooth out a little bit consumption. Maybe our data is terrible because the shock was bigger. Yeah, mobility is so much less, as you started saying, Miko, in this conference. But I think they learned that welfare state is important to reduce income inequality, but also to act as a smoothing device when something big happens like COVID-19. We don't see that clearly in the fifth plenum, and maybe Bert has a different opinion, but I don't see it clearly. But I think it's going to come, and that will have enormous consequences, because if you look at the pension expenditure in China, or even healthcare, is very small. We were actually finalizing a report on aging in Asia, and when you look at what Japan really spends compared to China, it's just scary. But China's fiscal deficit is already humongous. So where are they going to find the space to do that? And I think that's a very, very important question. So your socioeconomic question, I would divide it into easy jobs, the old type, plus some sort of welfare state, possibly cheap, again, tech, health tech, you know, things that you can do at a lower cost, but it might not be enough, especially for the pensions. There you actually need real money. So it is going to be a challenge, a very important challenge for China, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and you know, maybe over to you, Bert, and a little bit following up on this analysis. I think many of the items or the solutions presented here are not new. I mean, innovation, spurring consumption, and so on. That has all been in plans prior to the current one, which is in the drafting stages. At the same time, as you mentioned, there is a very big focus on security and on stability. So it seems to me there's this really big problem of you know, stepping on the brake while you really know that you have to step on the gas. So you know, do you think that the increasingly statist model and increasingly party guided model really can pull this off? Is it feasible, and is it realistic to achieve this modernization and high quality growth? Or do you think that there will have to make some relatively drastic changes in economic policy making?
Well, I mean, the honest answer is time will tell. But let me try a few things. First, in terms of innovation policy, I think China is pretty much on track for a middle-income country, a higher middle-income country. And what they invest, about almost now 2.5% of GDP. They're probably going to come up with a higher target, around 3% of GDP. And broadly, that is fine. What have they? Most of that is actually done by private enterprise or non-state enterprises. The Alibabas, the Tencents of the world that invest a lot, the Huawei's of the world, I count that as a non-state enterprise. They're the ones that spend tremendous amounts on innovation, but that is more sort of downstream innovation. What you see in China now is that you probably can expect more investment in science, and that's more state-led. Second, what is a fact is that there's an enormous increase in capability of innovation and science and technology. The numbers are absolutely stunning. I mean, there's 8 million people now graduating from college. Yes, the quality is not always as good, and half of those people are in the science and technology and mathematics sphere. So enormous amounts of people that become available for doing research, for pushing this innovation envelope. Third, there is of course a lot of efficiency gain to be had, and Alicia talked about this dilemma that in a way consumption keeps on being low and should be pushed up. Now, consumption, first of all, consumption doesn't drive growth. It's nice to have, but if you grow and you don't have consumption, what you have is external surpluses. They're not very nice, and you get a lot of comments from your trading partners, but there is, if you want, a way out. And it's what we've seen in the aftermath of COVID, where China's supply was back on track very soon. Just consumption was lagging, and therefore external surpluses increased. But China is investing 45% of GDP, and that is, it's simply too much. There's a lot of wastage there. There could be a lot of efficiency gains, better investments going forward. And probably the economy that is growing, the new economy, the more tech-based economy, the more information-based economy, requires a lot less investment as well. So you can, if you want, if you push that forward, you can save a lot of resources there, invest them somewhere else, or spend them somewhere else. Now, the downside to this state-led, and one, there is indeed not an absence, but only a token nod to state enterprise reforms. And state enterprises still play a very big role in the economy, and that's not going to change under Xi Jinping, as far as I can see. It's they're the guy, they're the vanguard. And mind you, talking about risk and security, they were also the ones that implemented the stimulus if and when needed. So they're an instrument of policy that can be drawn upon. But the downside of that is that private enterprises that usually bring a lot of the innovation to bear, they can't compete with state enterprises. And if state enterprises have a strong presence in a particular industry, basically private enterprises try to do something else because you can't win in that particular area. So that is I think a downside of the state-led type of model that China anticipates. Second, if you have a state-led model, you rely a lot on the wisdom of the planners, and there's a fair amount of wise planners. And if you want, a lot of the areas of attention of China's policy seem by and large the right areas, but you lose out on those areas that might surprise you, that might suddenly be a big growth factor. So the innovation from bottom up, that is a risk that you run if you run a heavily state-led system. Now, on the balance, just on the balance between, and some of the questions came in. Of course, the Alibaba question came in, and I like that because I can link that to the state versus market tension that there is in this plan, in the previous plan, in the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress. It has been there, this balance between state and market. What I read from the proposals, whether I like it or not, but basically the government says, look, yes, we want market to develop, and we want market to have the decisive role in the allocation of production factors. The line is repeated again, but we need to guide the market. So I guess Jack Ma just got some guidance from the regulator. So in other words, they want to manage that risk, and fair enough, there is a downside to it that you might squash innovation, but at the same time you can provide some regulatory base for new innovations to come up, as Alibaba has demonstrated in the past. I mean, for 15, 20 years, they had a very light regulatory environment in which they thrived. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I think it is pretty clear to everyone who follows China that it has never been so little doubt that, the Leninist rationality of, the state or the party as the vanguard being on the commanding heights of the economy, that is really something they take quite seriously. And, speaking of state-led investment and innovation, Alicia, you also mentioned this about, there being very little doubt now as to the balance of state and market in terms of who decides, who calls the shots. The last 5-year plan included some, China, the quite controversial Made in China 2025 strategy, and the whole drive to spur homegrown innovation, high tech, self-strengthening even is mentioned in the proposal. Do you see a doubling down on this very concrete technology support on investment strategies, very targeted industrial policy, and where would that drive us? Do you think that we are on the way to an even less level playing field, an increasingly WTO incompatible world, if you will?
It's a very good question, and I guess I would simply say yes, and I would leave it there. But I guess that's not fair, because although what you said looks very logical to me, many people may disagree. So I'm going to try to basically back your judgment with a little bit of insight, if I may say so. So I guess the way to look at it is maybe what I could say tech related dual circulation. Meaning, if we take the example of what this fantastic expression, which nobody knows where it comes from, it's like it's just first time I read it, I was like, I had to look it up. I thought it was Aristotelian or something like that, but it happens to be just the way the blood really circulates, which I was reminded I should know that, but I didn't. It is very important to realize that it's not so much about how it exits, i.e. exports, this circulation of blood, which is the second, but it's about how it enters, i.e. imports. And I think what it means for tech is that you're very open to export your tech. Maybe it is true we have an identity list. Maybe China, for the time being, doesn't want to export certain drones, but I don't think that's the theme. The theme is certainly not, I do not want to export my drones. The theme is, I want to even impose the standards for my drones to be the ones and only that, basically will dominate the market, which is a very different concept from self-reliance. I stay where I am. I become Latin America in the 70s, which some people read. I don't think that's what China wants, rightly so. What China wants is really on the entry side, imports. Whatever I import, I should make sure I still can get it if push comes to shove. And this is Bert's comment, which I fully agree that is very obvious in the fifth plenum, that the external environment has worsened, that we are under attack. So it is all about, I don't want to be dependent on, and tech is key, as I was trying to explain at the very beginning, because that's something you can't buy if somebody doesn't want you to buy it. And we have full proof of this in the last 2 years. So basically, the thing on industrial policy doesn't end there. It's not that I want to vertically integrate to consume everything I produce. No, I want to vertically integrate to then, and by the way, you mentioned China Manufacturing 2025, that's just the beginning. China Standards 2035 to me is a much more worrisome, in my opinion, issue for Europe. Once you have the standards, you have the production, which, by the way, I think Europe forgets. Why do we have the standards? Because we were the producers. How can you have the standards forever if you don't produce? I mean, somebody needs to explain this to me, because every time I hear this, I'm like, wait a minute, it can't possibly be true that you think you can keep your standards without being able to produce what those standards are for. But okay, that's just a little bit of, I had to say it because, I've heard it too many times. But to make a long story short, the type of industrial, so my answer was indeed, of course, industrial policy is as strong as ever, but in a way, in a smarter way, because it's not only about, I become the leader in a certain technology. No, I actually control the standards. I make sure that there's no input that I cannot replicate, just in case, that entry point gets stuck. And by the way, I keep on exporting, and we just had RCEP. If they didn't care about exports, why would they need RCEP? So for me, it's frankly master plan. So I would add yes, yes, yes to everything you said, and I would add, I'm quite clever, by the way. So I think Europe should take note of this.
Okay, I hope Europe does take note of this, and I think, you know, the American elections, they really drowned interest or attention maybe in the proposal in the fifth plenum, but I think it's slowly picking up, and I'm sure that the next five-year plan will stir some debates here in Europe. So I think there's a lot of questions coming in already, and it is time to maybe move on to the open Q&A. Before I do that, I have one question for, or the same question for the both of you, maybe a little bit cheeky, but what do you think? The 35 objectives, will Xi Jinping himself be the one who oversees them under his own rule? Will he sit for 2 or 3 more terms? What's your take on this?
I think he will be there beyond 2022, but so the next party Congress. But beyond that, it's too uncertain. I can't say.
Alicia, what's your take? No.
You know, it doesn't depend only on his will. You know, I mean, frankly speaking, I mean, although Biden is showing the way to how long you can you can go, but there's many other factors, yeah, that I think we just can't judge now. So if you ask me, is it his intention? Well, first of all, I don't know, but the signals are clearly there, because the more you give these targets, you offer targets that go beyond what frankly a human being can even, you know, like at least under normal circumstances, you kind of sense, yeah, put it this way. But that's not all, because there could be, you know, there could be other considerations. How, frankly speaking, how successful will this be? And I think there is really tailwinds for the next few years because of COVID and, you know, the scars elsewhere as opposed to China. Not that there won't be in China, but they won't be as large. But once that tailwind comes out, all of the downward pressure on China's potential growth is right there on our face. And there's a few questions on that, yeah, on aging. And it's not only aging, it's like labor participation is falling. I mean, there's too many, labor productivity is coming down. I mean, Bert knows about this wonderful report, Innovative China. You have it all there. TFP is not growing. I mean, tell me how you're going to keep this growth. I don't know. And I think that's when maybe questions will be asked, but it won't be now. So I agree with Bert, 2022, we'll see later.
All right, thank you. All right, so a lot of questions, as I said, are coming in, and I will now move over to the Q&A. If you are not a Zoom expert by now, you can either type your questions in the Q&A button, or you can raise your hand and we will prompt you the right to speak. So I think I just start with one question, and Cora Youngblood has raised her hand. So please, if you speak, please state your name and your affiliation just briefly, and keep the questions relatively brief. Thank you. Cora Youngblood, can you?
Yeah, thank you. I hope everybody's hearing now. Well, hello, I'm Cora from Pakistan System. Actually, hi, Alicia, nice to meet you again online. I have two quick questions. Maybe the first one, rather going to Alicia, because it's working on me. What about foreign direct investment in both ways, inward investment and also investment? What's the 5-year plan about this? And what's your second question,
I'm sorry, the sound is very bad. I cannot really hear what you're saying.
Well,
But,
I put the questions in the chat too. So if you cannot hear me clearly, you could also read them from the chat.
all right. As far as I see, it is concerning the plan, or what the plan will include as to Chinese foreign direct investment, both inwards and outwards, and what the role will be of that in this new growth model. I'm not sure which one of you two wants to address that question. Any takers?
Yeah, so I mean, let me give a take. So the Belt and Road is mentioned, but it's not very prominent. As a fact, all overseas foreign direct investment is not very prominent, and I think that's sort of where China is at the moment. There's quite a bit of sort of mending to do domestically. B, this is a more domestic-oriented 5-year plan. And C, of course, there's some complications with Belt and Road at the moment. The debt issues that have come up, not just with China, but more broadly in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, will require some time to fix. And so I think the proposals signal that, look, this is not going to be the most prominent thing going forward. I think secondarily, but that's not written down, there is a reassessment of China's earlier strategy, which was still very much in the 13th 5-year plan, to go out and acquire the technology needed for development. And that's where, well, I guess in Germany, you know all about that. That raised a lot of issues and basically a backlash against that strategy. So it's far less prominent now than it was in the previous plan.
All right, that's another question by Gunnar Wiegand. Please explain to which degree you consider the Chinese dual circulation concept could be applied in a similar way many in the US would like decoupling used. So, whether or not this is the same kind of thing. And do you consider that the EU's open strategic autonomy would contribute to reinforcing such tendencies? Maybe Alicia, you can take on this question.
So basically, I think these are 3 different models to the world's reality. This, I wouldn't call it deglobalizing world, but at least slightly fragmenting world because of this inward, if I may say, somewhat inward policy, but they are different. I think the US is very simple. I'm an importer. I have huge trade deficit. Frankly speaking, I can do by myself. I'm the tech hegemon, by the way. So, and I have energy. I don't need any of you. So it's kind of simple. China, as I was trying to explain, I think is a bit different because that's why it's dual circulation. I want to become, quote unquote, like the US, but I happen to be a net exporter. So that's not a good deal for me. I want to continue to export, but I want to make sure that that I'm truly independent, truly integrated, and thus independent from anybody else for my consumption and for my exports. And this is about, again, vertical integration and all of what I just said. So I won't repeat too much. I think Europe is basically, I don't want to be caught in between, and I want to be economically, so at least economically, since we can't do much more apparently. Sorry, my federalist, like youth comes to mind here, but since we can't do anything, at least we want to be economically sovereign. And I think that's but it's very different from being fully vertically integrated and just use the export machine and, nobody should enter my area. It's very different. So I don't think our approach is that of China, let alone that of the US. Yeah, that would be my answer.
But just to add to that, though, I mean, what I see in President-elect Biden's plan, it's not dual circulation. Obviously, it's not a concept that you can implement in a much more market-oriented economy as we have in the EU or the US. But what Biden's plan seem to reflect is, look, we need to compete more with China from domestic strength. So we need to invest more in our own R&D, in our own infrastructure, in our people, so that we can actually compete with China and then create a level playing field, but rather than the other way around, sort of blame China, attack China, and compete by attacking, if you want. So this is more like competing from domestic strength. I find that a relatively healthy attitude, and that is also something that that the EU, to some extent, reflects. I mean, the EU has these three planks of competing with China. One, it is a partner, it is a competitor, and it is an adversary. There's three, but in that context, there is a little bit of also learning from China and sort of trying to find ways of doing more in R&D, maybe doing a little bit more in industrial policy without breaking the commitment to market economies.
Yeah, thank you. That's very insightful. There's a couple of questions and more, and I would maybe like to synthesize two of them. And it is concerning the social security system. It's stated by Li Yang from the Paris School of Economics. And speaking of sustainability of China's social security system, is there any research or evidence to show that China's social security system is not sustainable? And another question pertaining to that issue is also in terms of risk management as a strategy to manage social security. Is there a new way or a smarter way now in the plan?
Okay, let me take that first, and then maybe Alicia can add. First, the current system of social security in China is quite decentralized, and in large parts of the country not sustainable, i.e. the cash out is bigger than the cash in, and at some point you then run out of money. There's some defense for that. There is a national social security fund that has been built up over the years, but it doesn't have enough money for the whole of the economy. In the plan, they say we need to have a more centralized system. And I think what it really means is let's at least pool at the provincial level. Let's pool the pensions there. But mind you, that's only the urban side of things. So that's the, if you want, the regular employment. The rural side is there is a basic pension, but the basic pensions are very low. And if you want to equalize urban and rural, there would be a tremendous gap between what is currently in the kitty, if you want, and what is what would be needed in commitments to deliver everybody a reasonably equal pension system. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not sustainable. It means that in future you need to take policy actions to make sure that there is sufficient cash to pay out your commitments. And so it requires policy actions going forward. By and large, what really pays for your pension system is the productivity of your economy. And as long as your productivity continues to grow and keeps pace with wages, or wages keep more or less pace with productivity, then it's a matter of transferring the money from one place of the economy to the other to keep it sustainable. So the productivity increases, the drive to more productivity-based growth could make pensions sustainable. And I say could because right now that is not yet the case. There's a lot of commitments out there, implicit or explicit, that are currently not met.
Do you want to add something?
I quite agree. I want to add just a little, because basically the point is that sustainability is path dependent. So it depends on your policies. And we heard rumors that retirement age might actually be increased as a consequence of this little detail in the fifth plenum about, it's a big thing. Actually, it's a taboo. I mean, if you ask me what's the topic that I find more difficult discussing in China, pension reform. It's quite interesting because, it's not only the West, it's like very, very important topic. And I would add the following. There's two things here to take into account. First, the productivity. Well, first of all, even if they increase retirement age, which is very low for actual female workers, is 50, so I would be retired by now. So I'm saying it's very low. They have a lot of room. Not every country has as much room, but the issue is that it's a one-off. Once you increase it, that's it. To keep that going, you need productivity. But labor productivity is, of course, positive growth, but decelerating in China. And at the same time in which aging is, and of course the basically the dependence ratio is increasing. So that is an issue. And I think that is why, I mean, tech has become literally God in China, because that's the way to solve this impossible problem. And in that regard, I think more is needed than just increasing retirement age, which, by the way, they haven't done for ages. So it doesn't seem to be so easy. And thus, sustainability can be solved, I agree, but it doesn't seem to be an easy thing to solve based on, past experience.
I think it's things like raising pension age and so on. It's that never goes down well, even in China, where you have an authoritarian government. They are probably a little bit afraid of the backlash. We have a question directed to Alicia by Verena Kantel. And it is on what you could call the buy local relocalization elements in the upcoming plan. So how good, that's the question, how good is our current overview on tendencies to change policy towards buy local in Chinese procurement tools in different sectors? And we have that in, for example, renewables and medtech. What are the next sectors that you would expect that need to fear increased localized provisions in the procurement?
Well, this, I mean, to make this question perhaps more general, is really about what you were saying. Are we actually doubling down, on rather than more market access, less market access? Because of course, procurement, I mean, it's not only about foreigners, but it's also about private companies, etc. I think my impression is that, yes, we're doubling down to answer that question. And I think we are going to see more localization. It's part of everything we've said. On that note, I want to, if you allow me, because I think it's quite important, Bert answer as to what's the best way to respond to China. Biden's way is, let's be more competitive. And we are publishing a blog at Google on exactly the point that this is about why we're losing share in Europe in the global value chain, believe it or not. And even, our own regional integration in terms of trade, at least intermediate goods, is coming down. It's just quite scary. And the role of China within Europe's value chain is increasing. So we basically argue, as Bert said, look at R&D, look at education, the gap with China is decreasing. So I agree with what Bert said, but this is what I want to say. It's not enough. And you may say, well, that's quite protectionism. You're going to start with all of the things we need to use to stop China. And I may look protectionist, but I want to say why I think this is not enough. And the reason is very simple, I think, to me, is that China's sheer size, and it's basically not only in China, but I mean, basically in every sector, if you look at the Fortune 500, it's just right there on your eyes. And that means that if that market is not open, it's going to affect your market no matter what you do. You can be the best in whatever sector in innovation, you're going to be so small that you might not be able, no matter we're not the US, by the way, we're 27 countries. If we were the US, maybe Biden's argument, I would buy it. But we're not the US. Our markets are still fragmented. Yes, we can do a lot. Let's make a better single market. But at the same time, the wave is of the size of, and I think we need to realize that it might not be enough just to be better. I think again, I don't want to sound protectionist, but I think we need to realize, and it might not be just to say we need to stop it all, but we may need to be slightly more selective as to what we want to keep. And I think that's something as Europeans we need to confront, because we love the multilateralism and all of what trade has brought to us and blah, blah, blah. But we never thought we would have, sorry to say, a non-market economy of the size of China in front of us, and we do have it. So the minute we kind of realize it, the better it will be for whatever decision we may want to take. But we're not the US. To Bert's point, I just want to add, we're not the US. That's very important in terms of how we may react. It may also mean we have nothing to do. Fine, at least we know it. But just not knowing it and thinking that everything is fine, I think that's something that is not very conducive to progress.
Thank you. And again, taking the points of a couple of questions together. This is a question about the instruments of the Chinese state wants to adopt to realize the 20K per capita goal. And the consumption-driven economy that is in some ways envisaged in the plan. And I think cities and urbanization is going to play a big role. And there's a very big focus on urbanization and quality urbanization. There's also not a clear strategy. I think there's, the Li Keqiang pushed, smaller cities, local cities, and there's a lot of hukou reform in the pipeline. But it's not really clear to me, at least, how that will all play out. So could you give your take on what are the concrete mechanisms that you think are feasible and what you think is realistic in the current environment and for the next plan?
So let me start. Look, I agree that frankly the current proposals don't give much detail at all. If you really want to summarize it, it's 60 paragraphs that are absolutely completely dense with all kinds of objectives, and they don't talk about instruments or hardly talk about instruments, and that is it if you want the downside. So we have to imagine some of the instruments. I mean, urbanization is potentially a very big driver of growth, of productivity, and indeed of consumption. But at the same time, there is an ambivalence in the current proposals between urbanization and rejuvenation of the countryside, of not getting everybody into the biggest cities where the people might be most productive. So, and there is still, yes, there is reform of hukou, but there's not an abolition of hukou. And as when I still worked with the World Bank, we argued that abolishing hukou would actually be entirely feasible, entirely affordable, and highly desirable. But for some reason, there's still this division between urban and rural. It has large income inequality issues. Again, during the COVID crisis, it was the rural migrant workers that got hit and had to go back, if you want, to the countryside, but without much of a social safety net. So they really lost a lot of income. So in this area, the policy recommendation is very clear: abolish hukou and then deal with the consequences. Just like Japan has dealt with very rapid urbanization in the past, Korea and others. But there seems to be a reluctance to that. We mentioned some others. The increase in pensionable age. I actually think that will happen now, and that will make a big difference. It will happen out of necessity, because without it, the labor force will decline quite rapidly. So moving on this perfectly natural increase in the retirement age. Given where China is in terms of life expectations, would be a big boost for the economy. It would get you some growth, but it would also help consumption because people earn more money for longer, and it would help solve part, not whole, but part of the problems that we talked about in the pension system. Third, and that is an area where China realizes the issue. There's a lot of discussion on income distribution issues in the proposals, but there is not a discussion on raising the personal income tax, taxing wealth more, and giving more transfers to poor people. The more standard reaction on how to solve some of the inequality issues. Again, that's not a total solution, but those would be instruments that could achieve the goals that China has stated. I think there will be some progress on the personal income tax, but it may not be fast enough. China remarkably has, through its tax and transfer system, has practically no redistribution, no net redistribution of income through its tax system and its transfer system, which is absolutely remarkable for a country that is soon to become a high income country. Let me stop here. I'm sure Alicia has to add.
Actually, not, because it was exactly on point of what I wanted to say, indeed.
We have another raised hand by Ruth Kirchner. Ruth, are you there? Remo Steinmetz has also. Remo Steinmetz? Yes, I think we can hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I'm sorry. I looked at the wrong name.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. So question would be on you mentioned it already at the beginning, Alicia, is food security, agriculture, and the rural part of China. What is your view on that? So we talked a lot about urban development, but I think this is kind of a dual game. If you urbanize and you need to feed population in urban areas, how does China tackle that dual, let's say, urban and rural policy at the same time?
Well, maybe I wasn't clear, because what I actually meant to say is that I think China has given up of being self-sufficient on food. I actually meant that I think that is something that probably they feel is well controlled. Of course, China has bought land in overseas. They've probably, I mean, with the BRI and everything which they have built around, I think they probably feel comfortable with that situation, which is in a way, how this urbanization can go on in a way. So to reach that growth goal, urbanization is needed. But before you actually do that, you need to make sure that you secure your resources. So I think that's basically what I meant to say. It doesn't mean like for every single thing, but I think that's basically where we're heading. And there's many products. It's already years that China is, of course, heavily dependent. Soy is the most obvious one, but there's others. And I think that's going to continue, because I don't think that's the bottleneck they worry about. Again, for the reason I mentioned, that they have, let's call it, captive markets, which they can always resort to and even own the land or the resources. So I think that's not a big issue, not as big as tech, absolutely. And I actually think not even energy, for the same reason. So when you look at the investments, I looked at the figures on BRI, is energy is actually the bulk of it. So I think they've already done their work and they can move on with other things. Yeah.
I would like to sneak in a question which is driving, which I think about a lot, and that is, and you, Bert, you mentioned this already in your opening remarks. It's the so-called green transition that is also mentioned in the document. And I mean, this is not a new thing, but it seems there is a little bit more attention and a little bit more top-level push also to this but I'm quite, I'm concerned because the incentive structure, you could say, in the bureaucracy for especially at local levels, the local decision makers is not geared towards favoring sustainable solutions at the moment, at least. Do you think that the new 5-year plan, do you think that the coming years really will see the structural change needed in the incentive structure, in the policy bias that local leaders will have to deal with to really facilitate a green transition?
Okay, I think there's two aspects to it. One is sort of the more localized environment and pollution issues. The 13th 5-year plan already had some conceptual solutions that are gradually being implemented, as often happens in China. They don't solve everything overnight, and not the whole policy changes throughout the whole country. But basically what they've said is that they've graded individual areas in China according to the ecological functions. And the more ecological you are, the less you, as a local official, need to take care of GDP growth or something else. You basically get ecological targets. That system seems to work quite okay. And there's been quite a bit of progress in water pollution, in soil pollution, and there's a lot of investment in that. Then there is the bigger issue, well, there's air pollution, big progress made as well. In part because of the energy system that is changing. Some, if you want, technical localized solutions for industry, that's going quite well. The very big question is, again, I come back to the 2060 target, but also the 2030 targets. The whole change in the energy system that for 70% or almost 70% still relies on coal, that needs to switch to a completely different setup. Now there I am in a way more optimistic, in part because the right issues are addressed. China already produces far more renewable energies than it actually uses. And a lot of it goes into Bitcoin farming, of mining, and pretty useless things. Why? Because the grid doesn't buy that renewable energy. For the first time, I saw as an objective in the plan, basically a marketization of the electricity, of the power system. If that happens, then you can imagine a system, if you have a true power market, usually if it's there, renewables are the cheapest solution. And your polluting coal-fired plants become backup solutions. And de facto, that already is to some extent the case. That will be far more pronounced if and when there is a reform in that system. So it requires a reform in the grid. The state grid and the southern grid have always been a problem. They maybe procure coal-fired power, in part because it's very reliable. You never run out of power, but it's also very polluting. So if that changes, you have far more opportunity for renewable energy. There's a second area, and that is, and there China made a mistake during the 13th 5-year plan period. At the beginning, they decentralized the approval over power plants, and it meant that a lot of provinces actually approved coal-fired plants, which was against the overall trend, but it happened. And so you still see the tail end of this. There's quite a bit of coal-fired plants still being built, not because that is now the direction of reforms, but because they were approved under this period when there was a provincial level approval. That was a mistake. They've reversed that, but you still see some of the damage.
All right, we are approaching the end, but I think maybe I will sneak in a last short question. I mean, the both of you are sitting in Asia, which seems to be tackling the COVID, at least some countries seem to be tackling the corona crisis differently and with somewhat more success in some areas. Do you think that the risk management, the way it's dealt with in China, is it geared to really provide the stability long term? Will we move to a reality where we increasingly will have to accept a dominant China, an increasingly dominant China in the future? Alicia, maybe you hit us off with this last, this last future telling.
So your question is whether the way they have handled COVID will make China stronger? Is that?
No. If there is a general, if the crisis management, of an authoritarian system, kind of is geared to this more uncertain world that we really are entering into.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, it's different. Okay, because that's whether I believe that rather than whether people believe that, which is a different question. I frankly think that, I mean, I wouldn't say China, but Asia's management of COVID is commendable. Let's face it. I mean, we just have to look at the results, and I think Europe should learn from it. And we actually might not be well placed to do that, because the thing is that you open your internal mobility by reducing your external mobility, and you can do that because you basically catch the thing at an early stage. Yeah, so that's why you don't need to lock down, and plus to lock down to the rest of the world. Imagine in Europe locking down to everybody else. I mean, we are a highly integrated region. So it's not, so first of all, I don't think it's easy to say that we were careless, or it's just that it's much harder, both because of when it was kind of tackled, second, because of this particular characteristic of Europe, that countries are actually very interrelated, which is not the case of Asia, not to the same level. And where it is the case, Singapore or Hong Kong, they're suffering the consequences. GDP will fall as much in Hong Kong as probably on average in Europe. So there's no secret. Now, beyond that, the internal versus external mobility, there's the issue of privacy and how you deal with that, and whether an authoritarian regime is better at doing that. Well, I mean, I always say, just look at Taiwan. So, I don't think, put it this way, it might be slightly easier, but I don't think it is required to be authoritarian to deal with a pandemic. It might be easier. I can understand the why it is easy, but I don't think it's required. So then we should ask ourselves, if it's not required, why aren't we, I guess that's the question, rather than, just say, let's go all for that, because to me, that is not the right answer, but that's just my personal opinion.
All right, thank you. So we are unfortunately coming to the end, and I apologize for those questions that were not addressed. The recording will, as I said before, be available on our MERICS homepage in a couple of days, so make sure to check that if you want to revisit the discussion. With that, I will thank everyone for the patience, going 3 minutes over time, and very warm thank you also to Bert and Alicia for sharing your insights on this really crucial matter of the next 14th five-year plan. So with that, I wish you a very nice afternoon or evening in Asia, wherever you are, a very nice rest of the remaining day. And with that, goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.